Hello, please let me see your ticket stubs for the double-edged double bill. This week, Julianne Moore dances through Boogie Nights with Hannibal. Each week, Adam Thomas and Thomas Mariani will come to the table to discuss the randomly selected yin and yang of a double feature. Then, both will have to pick a number between 1 and 10 or to seal their fates for the next episode. One will have two good movies, the other two bad ones. Let the chaos begin. I am Adam Thomas, and I'm for some reason going to say the term okie dokie several times.
And I'm Thomas Mariani, and I'm a bright shining star. Or, as you young kids might prefer me to say it, I'm a bright shining star! I'm a star!
Yeah, and I'm also going to refer to your mother and father as your mommy and daddy.
Great. Perfect.
Yeah.
This we need more of. For sure, mommies and daddies, as the internet loves. But welcome, everybody, to the Double-Edged Double Bill, in which every week Adam and I cover a good and a bad movie related to a particular topic. And this topic we decided to do here, it wasn't just decided on by us. Shout out to our patrons, patreon.com/DEDBpod. More on our patrons later in the show. They voted in a poll between two choices. It was between post-apocalyptic films, and the ultimate winner, Julianne Moore, because she has a couple movies that are coming out. Sharper, which is on Apple TV+, and When You Finish Saving the World, which is going to be in like a limited release. The, I believe, directorial debut of Jesse Eisenberg that premiered at Sundance last year. And it's her and Finn Wolfhard from Stranger Things. But yeah, we decided to have Julianne Moore on the docket because we always like covering an actor's career, and particularly with Julianne Moore, one of the best actresses working today. I would say she's been doing it for now like over 30 years, and she's always been a consistent great talent.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the consistent great talent. I think sometimes she maybe takes roles that we're probably going to talk about tonight several times that don't necessarily work for her, but they paycheck roles, so she can do her smaller stuff. It's usually the sort of smaller intimate pieces that she really really fucking shines in.
Right, but I would say she kind of fits along with another person we'd voted in episode 2, Natalie Portman, where even her bad performances, she makes choices. Not always the right choices, but big choices.
No, there's always a choice made. I would say she never really phones it in. It's just sometimes well, this is different.
Yeah, and she also, sometimes it's dependent on the material. Like, I would say the first time I ever saw her in anything, given my age bracket and everything, was definitely Lost World, Jurassic Park, which is not a movie that services her very well at all, whatsoever.
No, it doesn't. I'm trying to think if that's the first thing I've seen her in as well.
Well, I think we technically covered one that you just unconsciously, I don't think, were aware of her at the time, with The Fugitive. Given that was 93.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But that's such a small performance. The first thing I really took notice of her in was 9 Months, and then followed up quickly by Assassins, actually.
Yes. That's 95, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's right before. Yeah, I get that. That makes a lot of sense. But I would say, after my introduction to her in Lost World, she quickly became somebody, as I was starting to get more and more into movies, especially award season stuff, where she was somebody who was oh, she is a big actress who's not just in a lot of things, but also she is a great actress in general. And I mean, the receipts prove it, given now I have here listed all of her Oscar nominations, which interestingly I've recently either rewatched or watched for the first time all of these movies she was nominated for.
Big shocker.
Last week or so. Big shock. I go deep for research. But she was first nominated for Boogie Nights, which is one of our subjects today. We'll go into that a bit more later. But then in 2000 she was nominated for The End of the Affair, which is kind of a very typical Oscar movie she's very good in. But it's just kind of a whatever. I get why that's been forgotten to time. It's an Oscar movie from around.
I've never seen it.
It's her and Ray Fiennes having an affair in World War II.
Yep, still don't remember.
Yeah, whatever. And then, interestingly, 2003, she was nominated twice in the same Oscar year for Best Actress for Far From Heaven and Best Supporting Actress for The Hours. And she's only one of 12 actors to be nominated twice within the same Oscar year, which that club includes Faye Brainer, Teresa Wright, Barry Fitzgerald, Jessica Lange, Sigourney Weaver, Al Pacino, Holly Hunter, Emma Thompson, Jamie Foxx, Kate Blanchett, and Scarlett Johansson.
Took about 4 of those till I realized who the hell you were talking about. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, right, true, yeah. In terms of memorable names, yes, I get that.
Yeah.
And then in 2015, she was nominated and won finally for the first time for Still Alice, which
Yeah.
was not one of my double review choices, but I did watch it for the first time in prep for the show. And it's not
Oof.
one of those like, oh, like late career, like, oh, she like later in a career you earned this Oscar kind of thing for just the amount of times you've been nominated. It's a genuinely great, upsetting, beautiful
Oh,
performance from her.
it's a rough one. It's a rough one. But I think probably the biggest detriment to her, and I hate to word it that way, is that she really has a hard time pronouncing the word truck.
Especially singing it and
Yeah.
pronouncing it at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, Dear Evan Hansen. Once again, choices. She made a choice there how to sing that.
Yep.
But yeah, and I think like that, even the amount of those Oscar-y movies that she's done, I think it's a great example where like some people, like we've talked about like Meryl Streep on the show, where there were points in her career where it just felt like, oh, she's doing like a very sort of a typical Meryl Streep performance and just got nominated for it, as opposed to all of those performances of hers, having seen them all, at least have some wonderful like moments or like true realization of a character. She feels like she really lives in these kind of characters that she portrays in all these different movies.
Not a lot of Iron Lady performances.
No, I would say definitely not Iron Lady type of performances.
More
But
Ricky and the Flash.
yeah, I wish Rick Springfield was in one of these other movies with her too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and go into our movies now, though, which we picked at the end of our last episode, and we ended up with your good pick, Adam, of Boogie Nights, and then we'll go into my bad pick of Hannibal. So a lot to discuss with both of those movies. So let's go ahead and dive in with Boogie Nights.
In 1977, a kid from nowhere
Maybe think about your name.
My name, yeah.
Something with a little pizzazz.
Dirk Diggler.
Good name.
I like your name a lot.
had a dream of getting somewhere.
Jack Horner has found something special in newcomer Dirk Diggler.
It was a time when disco was king,
These are the ones. These are great.
Yeah, those are really cool. Are they lizard?
No, they're Italian.
sex was safe, pleasure was a business,
Cut. Terrific. Nice work.
and business was booming.
And the award goes to Mr. Dirk Diggler.
Wow.
Goodbye, 1979. Hello, 1980.
Are you ready?
But in 1980,
Come on, you puppies.
the party was over.
Jealousy, it's deceitfulness, it's vindictiveness. But, I mean, God, what can you expect when you're on top? Oh, wait. Love this part.
Boogie Nights.
So Boogie Nights came out October 10th, 1997, from writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson. This is only his second film after Hard 8, but this was definitely the movie that kind of put him on the map, given, it got a lot of acclaim, made a pretty solid amount of money, and it was nominated for 3 Oscars at the time. Best Supporting Actor for Burt Reynolds, Best Original Screenplay, and of course, Miss Moore was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, and this is a movie that, takes place in the porn world of like the late 70s into the early 80s, kind of marks sort of transition point for porn at this time in a post-Deep Throat world. There was initially a point where porn almost felt like, oh, it's going to be a bit more mainstream and opened up, and then that quickly crashed and burned and became more of like the on-tape porn that became so much more, of a factor and like increased distribution and kind of, in the eyes of a Burt Reynolds, tainted the purity to a certain degree of the porn film industry. But this was a cable staple. This was a movie my dad loves and was definitely the first Paul Thomas Anderson movie I saw. But Adam, why'd you want to have it as our good pick?
I mean, quite a few reasons. I'm really fascinated by 70s era porn, especially with sort of where celebrities we're going to see Deep Throat and things and it was getting this huge acclaim. If you've never seen the documentary Inside Deep Throat narrated by Dennis Hopper, I strongly suggest it. It's a great documentary. But I'm fascinated by it and like how this kind of crazy, like during the the 70s and the drug explosion and sort of sexual awakeness, that it almost became just like an open, not necessarily open secret, but like people watched porn, people enjoyed porn, and then it quickly got shut down, with like sort of the turn of the 80s and videotapes, but also sort of like political administration at the time and things like that. So I find the backstory kind of interesting. I also am very fascinated by like John Holmes, and Dirk Diggler is very much a John Holmes esque type personality. And Burt Reynolds, great performance, one of the top three Mark Wahlberg performances, but also probably maybe Heather Graham's best. Like there's a lot of career defining best performances in this. And it's funny, as great as Julianne Moore is in this, it's still not her best, I would say. But it's anytime she's on screen, you have just this utter just sympathy, and like just you feel so bad for her character, like to the point with yeah, her kids, she can't see her kids and she wants them, and of course the court looks bad because she's in the sex industry and all that, but she's also a drug addict and a drunk, and she's just doesn't know where she fits in the world. She's an aging porn starlet, and it's really sort of a layered, nuanced, just ultimately sad performance and character, but she does so much with it, and it's very subtle, except for the big scene with her and Heather Graham, especially where they're all drugged up. But it's just a really, really great performance from a female lead like this. I I would say this is probably. I mean, obviously, this was her first nomination or whatever, but I'd say this is 100%. You're watching a career-making performance.
That's true. Yeah, she had done earlier very good performances. Like this is a couple of years removed from Todd Haynes' Safe, which I recently watched as well. As a great performance from her in that movie. But this definitely feels like I agree with you in terms of like putting her on the map necessarily. This is the same year, ironically, as Lost World. So like the Oscar crowd's getting her in this, and the big blockbuster folks are seeing her in the other movie. So this definitely feels like this is the year where she truly like expanded into like the name actress kind of category. And I think the thing is, as great as she is, it is a weird thing where this whole cast in general is amazing. Like it's a great example of the sort of actor mantra of there is no small part, because everybody makes a massive impression no matter how small their role is. Where you got, like we mentioned, Reynolds and Wahlberg and Heather Graham and so many other people, but then you got Don Cheadle, John C. Reilly, William H. Macy, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Louise Guzman, Philip Baker Hall, Thomas Jane, the fucking Alfred Molina's amazing one-scene performance. Everybody makes the most of like whatever character there is, and I think Anderson does a great job with not only like writing out all these characters to where every single side character has an interesting little story we get glimpses of, but even the way that he shoots the movie with like the big tracking shots. This is one of the great examples to me of like where a tracking shot isn't just done to be showy, it actually tells you the story of all these characters, and it's interesting not because of the technical craft of it, like I think some directors like rely too much on Inarritu. But I think Anderson knows how to use the camera to actually tell the story of all these people and keep you invested, so the craft actually has purpose to it.
Yeah, I agree, but I also think the point of it being a little flashy is on purpose because of sort of the era it's showing in these parties filled with decadence and just sort of these crazy characters moving in and out of sort of the main narrative. Like I don't. It works. It's sort of when the cinematography is used to push the narrative and works as sort of a storytelling device. Instead of just look how cool I could do this, Quentin Tarantino in a radio. But yeah, it's really just beautifully shot. And by the way, the sort of soundtrack is just full of bangers. There are so many good needle drops in this movie. I mean, nobody gave a shit about Sister Christian for a long time until this movie came out. It sort of brought that song back, and it works perfect.
Or even right from the beginning, like that amazing tracking shot at the beginning with Luis Guzman's club and everything set to Best of My Love is such a great use of that fucking song. It instantly gets you into the atmosphere of the movie.
And I love Luis Guzman too, but I will say this might be some of his best work too. He's a great character actor. He's always a fun presence, but in this one, there's more depth to him than you usually get.
Right, but also it really honed the Luis Guzman kind of personality.
No, for sure.
Has been used absolutely. Especially the whole thing. Anytime he talks to Julianne Moore about just like, I'm a Latin lover, I just you have to give me one of these movies. I'm going to be perfect for it.
I know, it's like little short, stout Louise Guzman. It's great. Um, but yeah, to get sort of to the sort of woman of the hour in this, I mean, there's several scenes in this that are just sort of like incredible. Like obviously the drug sort of "I'll be your mother" scene with Heather Graham, incredible. The courtroom scene, fucking heartbreaking. But then the scene where she first is with Dirk Diggler on set, and you almost like obviously it's pleasuring her and she's enjoying it, but you almost get like she's it's more to it than that. Like it's sort of an understatement. Like she's not necessarily falling in love with this kid as a lover, but as like someone she can like take care of, and calls her baby and all that. Like it's really weird, but it's just she's so great, and just sort of the reaction of everybody watching it happen. Like Burt Reynolds and Philip Seymour Hoffman, who by the way has some of the best sort of reaction shots ever in this movie. Like he's just so into it and sweaty and like basically orgasming. It's just it's really kind of like I said, it's a career defining, not career defining, but a career making performance, and it absolutely earns that. Like it's not one where some people who get like all of a sudden they're a huge star because they were pretty good in something, and then like sort of the next movie they keep defining stuff. Like she went from being pretty good to like fucking what the fuck. She's masterful in this. And then, like you said too, it also helps where you can watch this in the same year. This really great, nuanced, kind of disturbing but sad, depressing performance, just rife with emotion and sadness, to watching her in this giant, huge blockbuster acting, with Jeff Goldblum and CGI dinosaurs. Not to say she's great in that, but she's fully capable of it. But you get the full range of what she can do in a span of 2 movies.
Well, and even within this movie, like with that scene you're talking about, I think it's a great example of like one of the best ways you can tell how good an actor is by how well they can play bad acting. And in that scene where she does like the whole porn acting against Mark Wahlberg, like her purposefully like bad porn acting there feels authentic. It doesn't feel like she's going too far into like, oh, I can't, like, I don't really remember my lines, or I'm going like too over the top. It's the perfect subtle amount of just like she doesn't have a lot of range as an actress within the movie, but only a great actor can pull that kind of thing off. And it's so like it's both funny and also kind of sad, given like how she's so invested in this, but yet she's not that great of an actress at the same time. I love that particular element. Works so perfectly for giving you more about that character who, like you mentioned, has so much nuance to where she's very motherly, but she has no structure because she's such like an addict. So she can't actually be either motherly to her actual son or to these sort of den children that she's put around her, like Dirk and Roller Girl. And I think there's like a real tragedy to that, where even when she's not on coke, she feels always sort of like in a distant haze, to where it's almost implied like, is she on like some kind of like downer pill when she's not on coke?
Right, or she's a burnout, dude.
Right.
She's just done so much that she's in a constant state of like, just sort of, if she's not stoned, she's sort of comatose. To me, maybe take out the sort of sex aspect of it, but to me, Julianne Moore's character is like, I think most of us had them, where your buddy had like the cool mom, where you'd be able to go over there and like drink and smoke in the basement, and like as long as you don't go anywhere. And you're like, at the time, you're like, dude, your mom's so cool. When you get older, you're like, oh God, what the fuck? How awful. Like just the worst parenting. And that's sort of the character to me she plays in this, where she'd be the mom who would come and smoke a joint with the fucking 15-year-old kids hanging out in the basement, and then go upstairs like, oh, you guys just be safe. I mean, that type of shit.
Right. I would at least give her the credit of she would probably hang out in the basement with them and supervise them, but just not very attentively. I think that's the thing.
She'd down there drinking them. She'd be down there drinking with them, but still watching them. Right, which is way worse in a way. I mean, I don't know. Who knows? Drawing straws,
but I mean, at the same time, there's still like a real sympathy you have for her, and especially with like the almost the hint that like she seems like she was also like maybe a previous version of a roller girl to Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, she was a big star at one point. Like I said, she's sort of this aging porn starlet who's not necessarily in the limelight anymore.
Right, and all that she's known as this life under Burt Reynolds' wing.
Right, exactly. And yes, I will agree, she does do the best sort of porn acting in this.
Yes.
Mark Wahlberg, when he's doing it, just feels like it's Mark Wahlberg.
Right, which I guess we should address more of the Wahlberg of it all, because it's weird how like our post-show chats, at some point Mark Wahlberg will usually come up and you will be very, I think, justifiably annoyed by his especially current presence.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to get it out of the way, anybody who uses religion as excuse to cover up hate crimes,
Yep.
or to sort of seek acceptance now for all the awful shit that came out about you, fuck you.
And including Boogie Nights in that, where there was some event where he went out and was just like, I pray to that God's a movie fan because hopefully he forgives me for my transgressions. It's like, oh, like what roles? He's like, Boogie Nights is pretty high on that list. Like, sure. Yeah, because it's a porn movie, sure.
Yeah,
sure, Jan.
Your best performance, you mean?
Right. What I think works about him in this movie is the fact that, like, he is so incredibly well utilized when he's playing somebody who is, quite frankly, dumb.
I was going to say, for a lack of a better term, dumb.
Yes, and I think he works perfectly like this, or like sort of some of the comedy roles he would take later, like the other guys and some of the other things. Like even the Ted movies, I think they utilize him well as like, you're a fucking idiot who doesn't know what he's doing.
You're a hot idiot. That's what you are.
Right. And especially at this point, it's utilizing his youth and his innocence really well, where like you see him initially as like a dishwasher boy, and he's just like, oh yeah, you know, I come up here and I want to be like a part of the nightclub scene, and it's like, oh, you're hiding something behind your pants there. Burt Reynolds is saying that to him, and it's like, you know, you want to see it? It's $10.
It's a better version of the Ryan Phillippe character from 54.
Yes, definitely. I think that movie's clearly inspired by a Boogie Nights in a lot of ways, that way in particular. Yes.
Yeah. You know, he's really good in this, but Wahlberg gets to act with some of the actors at the top of their game in this. Like we said, Julianne Moore, Burt Reynolds, John C. Reilly and him are such a fun duo.
Yes, 100%.
Like they're so fun.
Them doing the dumb, like, sort of porn action movie is amazing. Like, that footage is so fucking funny. And it feels like an early precursor as well for Riley's comedy career. Because at this point, he was more in, like, some of the dramas. Like, he'd been in Hard 8, and, like, he's going to do Magnolia right after this. But it feels like a precursor to, like, the Step Brothers and Talladega Nights kind of, like, comedic stuff he would become, honestly, known for to a lot of, like, younger audiences at this point.
Right, because he's great at it. But the thing is, he's also just a brilliant character actor.
Yes.
Like I say, John C. Reilly's so good. Like, watch this, watch Chicago, watch Gangs in New York. Watch some of these other, and you're like, whoa, that's a fucking John C. Reilly? Like, yeah, he's really great.
My favorite use of him is definitely, like, during the interview stuff where they're talking about, like, the making of this particular, like, porn they're doing, and he talks about violence, and Sim's just like, well, violence is, you know, it's something I think about a lot, and I think it's, like, really messed up that it does it, but I'm also pretty cool at karate and stuff like that. And it all is like very clearly like improvised, and it feels like an early example of like that kind of the Judd Apatow stuff he would do later, where he's like improvising that, or the bit later on when they try and take the tapes, and he's just like, well, we need those tapes in order to get a record contract, and those tapes are technically your property, but the magic on them is ours.
Oh, it's so bad too. Yeah, I don't want to sound hyperbolic or nothing. Like it's so good. I love like the shoe shopping scene that turns into them wearing the same suits and they're dancing at the club. Like they just build up this crazy friendship and bond these guys have just by finding each other at a weird party, at a porn party, basically.
Right, and then as like things get more decadent when they join up with Thomas Jane later, it's just like, oh, these two kids, you don't need to be here.
Dirk makes him a star, basically, because they become friends. And he's like, oh, I want to use him, and you know, and it's kind of a really sweet friendship. I mean, they go down dark roads, but you could tell that like they really care about each other.
I want to ask, who is your favorite sort of like of the side people? Because I would argue Reynolds, Moore, Graham, and Wahlberg are like the main four that we like see more of. But who would you say of like the various side characters is your favorite if you could narrow one down?
I mean, I'm not going to say Molina because he was only in one scene, but probably my two favorite is either Buck, which is Don Cheadle, because I just love his character where he's playing country music at the speaker store and all this.
Well, this is my look.
Shit.
This is my look. I love it.
Oh, listen to that bass! You can really hear the twang. Like, he's great, but William H. Macy is such like a tragic character in this. And he's so good, and you feel so bad for him. Like he's just constantly being cucked, and like against his will. Yeah,
which is an accurate term, everybody. Like that's like dumb internet speak, but it's literally what it is.
Mm-hmm. And the woman playing the wife, Nina Hartley, who is also like an aging porn starlet, she's really good in it too, just for her couple scenes.
I mean, you took my absolute favorite, which is Cheadle. I love him
He's
so
so
much in
good.
this movie. That the whole journey and like eventually with like the donut shop thing and the side relationship he has with that one woman and all this other stuff. Like he gets like weirdly the happiest ending, I would say, which is like he has his own business and it's like
Where it comes
thriving.
about some of the most crazy circumstances, but yeah.
Right. Yes. Like, but I would say if like I agree with you that like there's so many others, but I think we should talk more about like if I had a second favorite, it is definitely Hoffman. Hoffman
good.
is so wonderful in this movie. Like the moment he shows up in his ill-fitting tank top is one of many ill-fitting clothing choices. But when he looks around, and a great example of the needle drop actually working for like the character and moving the story along, where they play that the "You Sexy Thing" song as he's looking at Mark Wahlberg, instantly tells you everything about like, oh, this dude is like, you know, a repressed homosexual and such a tragedy for him. And later on, when he has the scene with Mark Wahlberg where he kisses him and leads to such a beautiful, sad, but also kind of funny moment. Just like, I'm a fucking idiot, man. I'm a fucking idiot.
Yeah.
It's so
Why would you
good.
do that? It's so good. Yeah, no, Hoffman. Well, Hoffman. That's the thing. He does so much with body language in this too. Like I said, when he's watching him and sort of the faces he's making, but even he's slowly like gyrating and moving his body and sweating and breathing heavily, and it's so much without doing a whole lot. It's really great.
Or particularly the way that he picks up the cake at that wedding, where like half of it falls off his plate and then he like eats part of it.
I know, it's so weird. But one of the reasons that I didn't pick him, which I do love his performances, he makes me feel not uncomfortable, but I'm just like I just feel so awkward by this guy. Like you just want him to like come out of his shell so bad. So I just like, oh, poor guy. Oh, you poor guy. Oh, so but I guess that's I mean Macy's sort of the same way. Although what happens with Macy is fucking insane too.
Yeah, and is like the great sort of like midway turning point of the movie with like that New Year's Eve 1980 party, where this movie is very literally about like that transition from one era to the next, and the pinpoint of William H. Macy just being cucked for the last time and going full psycho, killing two people and then himself, is instantaneously just like, oh, this is like everything's changing. Like this is all like falling apart instantaneously. And like you get hints of like sort of that lack of communication earlier when everyone has sort of like that brash confidence. Like I love probably my favorite comedic bit of the movie is Riley and Cheadle at the bar where they can't hear each other as he's doing the magic trick, and Cheadle talks about dark forces, which is amazing. But it represents also like it's a comedic moment that initially gives you that thing of like, oh, they're all brash and nothing's gonna fall apart even though they can't communicate correctly. So then by the time that New Year's Eve party happens, that is the beginning of the downturn of everyone just having the brash confidence but without anything to back it up, as like the porn industry changes and their coke habits fall apart and all it just like really crumbles around them. It's such a great indicator of just like, and everything's different now right from that point.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. You know, this is definitely one of those. I remember, you know, so much attention was drawn to it because of the obviously the nudity and the infamous like sort of dick shot that you get at the end. But I think this movie unfairly got sort of, I don't want to say crucified, but criticized because oh, it's basically softcore porn. It's really not. It's really not.
It's oddly a very sort of like tame treatment of sex where like there's nudity, but at the same time it's treated as just more of like, oh, this is our job that we do.
Right, exactly. It's all very clinical. Like, oh, you know, when they're doing, oh, I could flip her this way and I could still do this. And like none of this sex and nudity in this movie is like erotic. Like it's all very kind of uncomfortable.
No, I think it does a great job of treating that, like, because obviously a lot of other movies would demonize sex work to any degree, and this is definitely a movie that doesn't do that. I think I would say like 99% of it, the only time I feel it kind of does is there's the bit where it's between like the sort of the bang bus thing in the limo, and then Mark Wahlberg like basically like at his lowest point jerking off in that car before he gets beat up. That's the one time where it veers, I think, dangerously toward that, which is not helped by my least favorite element of this movie, which I think is like nearly a perfect movie. As much as I love all the like actual soundtrack drops, I don't like any of the original music. I think the original music,
no,
feels,
yeah,
like,
it doesn't work. Yeah,
especially that sequence is scored to like a weird bell toll music that's just like dun, dun, done, and it's like goes on for fucking ever. It's just like I do not like that original score drop particularly there.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. It does toe the line of sort of, you know, well, look what he's become because of the sex industry. But is that really what it's saying, or is it saying look what he's become because he let himself get so out of control? You know, because there's the courtroom scene where because of what Julianne Moore does, she can't see her kid. Like the drugs and stuff aren't, that's part of it. But the main focus is that she's in the sex work industry. Same with like Buck and him trying to do other things, and nobody taking these guys seriously, and you kind of feel bad for them. I think it's almost like a sympathetic look at, these. They're still just they're people.
Right. I would argue those two sequences you mentioned are doing more about just sort of the perspective society has on this versus like what
Right.
the
Yeah.
like
Right.
versus that particular one. I think is like a bit more like sort of toeing that line.
But again, though, that's also very much like John Holmes. Like if you
Right.
do any research on John Holmes, that's kind of what he became, unfortunately, because he became not a horrible, but he became a drug addict who, had AIDS and then was involved in like the Wonderland murders and all this stuff. Like John Holmes was a very tragic figure. And unfortunately, if you watch, there are a lot of documentaries out there about, people who are in the porn industry. Like I think there's a series of 3 or 4 of them now, like After Porn Ends. And some of them are really good and poignant. And, you get kind of the full range. You get people who are no longer in the industry just because they don't look bad about it, but they're older now and they just want to live the life. But then you get ones who like turn to religion. You get some that were fucked up on drugs because of it. Like it runs the whole gamut. But at the same time, look at normal acting. Like you run that whole gamut too. It's just, I think the problem is that people look at it like, oh, it's sex, so it's dirty, therefore it can't be taken. Like seriously, there's something wrong with these people.
Right, that kind of prudish attitude, which was definitely emphasized, like you mentioned, by like sort of the Reagan administration coming in the 80s and kind of like demonizing even further.
That's what I meant to say. I just don't want the ghost of Ronald Reagan to haunt me tonight.
Oh, well. Oh, no. He's here.
You stupid bastard.
Why don't you guys cover Bedtime for Bonzo as a good pick?
I'm going to tear out your throat.
And I think this movie does a great job of emphasizing that with like how for some people this is like a phase of their lives, like Don Cheadle, where like we see him hang around, we don't even see him like act in any of the porn movies, but he's there and it's like it was something that was a part of his life. But seeing him move on, and some people like either like change career paths, then they're like Julianne Moore becoming more of like a director by the end of that, which I love seeing her kind of like take on a slightly different role, or some people like return back to it like Mark Wahlberg, and it doesn't like completely down cry or praise necessarily any of those things as much as just like, I don't know, people kind of like drift through life and move through different paths, and I love how it emphasizes all of that, especially with, like after so much harrowing stuff during that second half, like there's so much more we can go into, but we'll just say like the Alfred Molina scene we mentioned earlier, amazing. Beautiful.
Oh, so tense.
Such a great
Terrifying.
scene. And so much great detail with like the firecrackers and the guy who is like got the coat on but doesn't have an undershirt and shit like that. So much great detail. But yeah, like that scene's great. There's so much other stuff. Adam, is there anything else you want to like kind of mention before we go into like final thoughts and wrap up on Boogie Nights? Any other things you want to shout out that are so great in this movie?
I mean, like I said, there's so much good about it. And the thing about this movie, it often, I mean, obviously it's a period piece, but it feels so authentic too. That's another thing that this movie really does right, with the sort of wardrobe, the hair design, the cars, the sets, everything. Like you feel you are right in the middle of 1970s in the Valley. Like this is 1970s porn in LA. Like that era. Like it's so well done. Everything feels so correct. It's just one of those movies where, a lot of period movies, like, oh yeah, but you'll maybe notice 1 or 2 things, or it's so shot so slick where it kind of takes you out of it. Like one that I can really think of is like Django Unchained, where like it's supposed to take place in the West, but it's shot so slick and everything, and plus sunglasses. Like no, those don't exist then, and like it kind of takes you out of it. Where this one, like you feel like you're right in there. I will say another one of his that recently did it, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but like Licorice Pizza. Like you feel like you're right in that era, and I think Anderson's kind of a master of that.
Yeah, with a lot of his other things too, like There'll Be Blood, and even Phantom Thread has a lot of that similar kind
Which
of
I
thing.
just recently rewatched There Will Be Blood. I got a lot to say about that one. I don't know how I feel about it.
Oh, well, put it in a back pocket for potentially cover for a different episode. Yeah, I mean, I do also want to emphasize with like we kind of referenced it, but I love like sort of Reynolds' character in terms of like how he treats the art of this so seriously. And how he really wants to like say like, oh, I want to make an actual great film within like the porn industry, and how he like has the sort of collaborations with like Ricky Jay, who's great as the editor dude. When they're like looking over the big stuff, he's just like, this is what I want to be remembered for. And then later on the stuff with Philip Baker Hall, and about that transition to video where he's like, no, I'm not gonna sully my work by doing videotape. And Philip Baker Hall's amazing reaction, just like, look, I love cinema. I love to see people fucking. It's just so fucking good.
Yeah, and I always, and again, I don't remember the actor, but I've seen him in 100 things. The one who comes in and, is like, may I see your cock? And he looks at it, he's like, thank you very much. And then walks off. That guy's great in this too.
Yeah, the guy who plays the Colonel.
Yeah, the Colonel. Yeah, he's been in a ton of shit.
Robert Wrigley.
Yeah, Robert Wrigley. He's great, man. He's been in a ton of stuff.
Right, yeah, and especially like the path that character goes down. The whole scene with him and Burt Reynolds at the police station. Another instant point, just like, oh, everything's falling apart. Just everything's completely destroyed at this point. Yeah, there's shout out a person who I don't think gets enough credit, but I think she's a great actress who didn't have like a huge film career. Joanne Gleason as Dirk Diggler's mother.
She's great.
Who is like so upsetting.
Terrible. Yes. Upsetting as fuck. What a horrible scene. Great scene, but horrible.
Yes, she's more known for Broadway, including she won the Tony for Into the Woods, and that recording is one of my favorite things of her performing it with the original Broadway cast.
She's pretty great.
Yes, but you know what, Adam? We got a whole other movie to talk about, and there's a lot of context to that movie as well that we'll go into. So, very quick final thoughts on Boogie Nights.
It's one of those movies that, it stands test time. I think it kind of always will. Just because how accurately it did the 70s and sort of how universal the story can be in this. Most modern film buffs have probably seen this, but if you haven't, I mean, it's definitely worth your time. It's just a phenomenal movie. It's damn near a perfect movie. This is easily a 4 to a 4.5 out of 5 movie. It's fucking great.
Yeah, I love it. I think for a guy who's as celebrated as Paul Thomas Anderson is, I would say this one was, while it broke him out, I think a lot of people have, especially who love like some of his later movies, like There'll Be Blood and stuff, have kind of like put this one off to like, oh, it was just an early success, as opposed to, I think it's my second favorite after a movie we covered before, Punch Drunk Love, which I know Adam and I disagree on, but I think is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think this is like right afterward, like it's like incredibly watchable movie. It is so like enjoyable, but also like has all these like deeper context that we're talking about the porn industry and how sex work is treated in society and all this other stuff. And for the woman of the hour, it is one of the great Julianne Moore performances, and one of the early really great ones that would sell her career from here on. And it's a great choice for a good pick for pretty much any of the actors in this movie. If we did a John C. Reilly episode, if we did a Don Cheadle episode, it would be a perfect good pick for any of them.
Yeah.
But now, let's get into our bad pick here, Adam, of Hannibal.
The person I'm looking for is quite well known. He's killed 14 people that we know of.
You ever think he might come after you?
Oh, at least 30 seconds of every day. Hello?
Is this Clarice? Oh, hello, Clarice. I've been in a state of hibernation. I need some action, Clarice. I couldn't help noticing on the FBI's rather dull public website that I have been elevated to the more prestigious 10 most wanted list. Is this coincidence, or are you back on the case? You naughty girl.
So Hannibal is from director Ridley Scott and created writers David Mamet and Steven Zalian, based on the novel by Thomas Harris, and came out February 9th, 2001, almost a decade to the day after the film it's a sequel to, which Silence of the Lambs. So we should probably go into a bit. This is part of the Hannibal Lecter franchise. which previous to this there had been Silence of the Lambs, obviously, and Manhunter, which was a different adaptation of a book that would later be adapted a year and a half after Hannibal, again, with Red Dragon, and featuring Anthony Hopkins reprising the role of Dr. Hannibal Lecter, as he does here. And we should probably talk a bit about sort of our thoughts on the Hannibal character in Silence of the Lambs and stuff like that. Adam, how do you feel about that franchise, and particularly Silence of the Lambs, given this is the direct sequel?
Well, it's funny. I actually, crazy, I did a little bit of research, but not based on our topic, but I went back and watched all of the Hannibal films, except for Manhunter. I just stuck with the Anthony Hopkins ones and sort of the prequel. Because I've seen Manhunter.
So, which would be Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, Red Dragon, and Hannibal Rising.
And Hannibal Rising, yes. And then I also rewatched the second half of season 3 of the TV show, which covers Red Dragon. I'm a fan. I like it, but it's also one of those where it's almost like a car crash. Like, it's gruesome, it's disturbing, it's terrible, but I gotta watch it. And I always feel bad afterwards. Like, I think they're great movies. Well, not great movies. I think, Silence of the Lambs is great. Silence of the Lambs to me is, well, it's a horror film. I don't care what anybody says, but it is a horror film. And also, Ted Levine's one of my favorite movie villains of all time that no one really talks about. I think he's so disturbing and creepy and weird. But just the way that movie's shot with the close-ups and everything, and Anthony Hopkins is terrifying, and I think it's a kind of a masterpiece. And I've read the books. I really liked the books, particularly Red Dragon. I think it's a great book. So yeah, I guess I'm a fan of the Hannibal Lecter sort of IP. It's just, am I a fan of everything we've gotten out of it? No, not necessarily.
Yeah, I think Hannibal is fascinating as sort of like its weird franchise, what has been wrought of it. Because I do agree that I think Silence of the Lambs is like a near perfect movie to me. Some of the stuff where admittingly, I think people do talk about sort of the Buffalo Bill character, but it's a lot more, I think, in recent years, kind of like how that depiction sort of affected how trans people were treated, which I get.
I mean, I get that too. But the only thing with me is, though, he's clearly not okay.
Right, and they also, the movie at least tries to go to great pains to say like he's not a traditional trans person.
Yeah, he's a psychopath.
They try, but it's a messy cultural legacy that we don't necessarily have the best perspective to have on it necessarily. I get.
Oh, zero. No, we have zero.
No,
yeah, zero
whatsoever. Yeah. I get it, but at the same time, like I also rewatched all the movies that relate to Hannibal, including Manhunter, and I just think Silence of the Lambs is such a perfect movie. And has, admittingly, a great setup for, like, what you would think you would want from a sequel. Where it's just like, oh, Hannibal's out and he's on the loose. But I just think every single follow-up that's happened after Silence of the Lambs that isn't like the TV show, which I do love. I think the TV show does such a great recontextualizing of all these stories.
It's so
fucking amazing show. Yes, for sure. But I think the movies that followed just have this weird thing where they try and kind of apply the sort of natural horror franchise mentality of like, oh, we start to like kind of get invested in the villain, like in the way that like Freddy Krueger becomes more invested in the sequels after Nightmare on Elm Street. But I don't think that works for Hannibal as a character, and I think that's a detriment, especially with Hannibal 2001, the film. I think does such a weird attempt at like making him more of like kind of like it's a movie that knows the iconic sort of legacy of Silence of the Lambs like a decade after, and I think that's totally to the movie's detriment and also to the character's detriment.
I completely agree. They try to turn him into this sort of, making him and Clarice have almost like a romantic angle.
Which, to be fair, the book did a lot worse of a job of, from what I've heard, with like the ending of that. Hannibal, the 1999 book. Yeah. Right. What I've heard is like, oh, that would have been a way worse ending than this ending, like kind of rushed bad ending that we get.
It definitely would have been. Yeah. But I think that is a huge problem because I don't think, not necessarily, you should never humanize Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter works as this sort of entity where if once you start putting on, I think that's one of the biggest problems with sort of Hannibal Rising and all that too, where you're like, I don't want to feel sympathy for this guy. I think Hannibal Lecter as a character works best as this sort of muted down psychopath, cannibal, serial killer. Like he's a serial killer. I don't want to see like, well, this is why he's a serial killer. I don't need that. I understand that happens sometimes in society with serial killers, but also sometimes in society with serial killers, they're just fucking crazy. Like nurture versus nature, I understand the idea of that, but that's not always the case.
Right, Hannibal feels a bit more like, to contrast with like in Silence of the Lambs, what I love so much is that Buffalo Bill feels more like the garden variety sort of serial killer.
Yeah,
in terms of like,
right.
it feels like somebody who would actually exist, has some kind of like basis in reality. And then Hannibal Lecter is like, they captured Satan in a box briefly. He's there in that box, and Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling encounters him and has brief glimpses of him, but it's like she can't even stay near him for too long because like she'll be wrapped up in his demonic grasp if she's around too long. And then when he escapes, it's just like, well, he's out there. Like, you can capture a Buffalo Bill, but you can never contain the true evil of Hannibal for too long.
He has dark as eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes.
I love that quote from Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, but no, the thing is, and obviously, honestly, what I think works best about Silence of the Lambs, and even though Red Dragon, it's very flawed, but the television show I'd include in this too works best where Hannibal's not the main foil. You need the sort of Buffalo Bills or the Francis Dorla Hydes, or some of these other like sort of serial killers you get in the show. That's what you need.
Right, and this movie tries to have that.
Not really. I mean, they kind of do with the Mason Verger character.
Yeah, I would argue they were trying to do that with Mason Verger.
Which, by the way, though, I will say, pretty great performance from Gary Oldman.
I think it's great makeup. I would not say it's necessarily a great performance. But I mean, I have like so many issues.
I guess that's fair.
Right, because I mean, because this is the character obviously where they set him up as like he and Hannibal had an encounter in which he fed him drugs and eventually caused him to like cut off his face while he was on drugs. And he's this gay pedophile. I think this one is more of like a malicious example of like a queer villain than like a Buffalo Bill to me, because he's so much more explicitly like awful, and especially like the encounter that they have in that really weird like bad Shutterstock filming of whatever they do, like
really
Gary
bad.
Oldman's face.
It's really bad.
And it feels like, because they emphasize it's like, oh, it's almost like he and Hannibal were about to have like almost a romantic encounter, and then the poppers came in and then they like cut off his face. It feels just like we're going full on to like, oh, not only is he an awful pedophile piece of shit, but he's also gay, so he's bad news. It just feels like so disgusting and offensive to me.
I definitely agree, but it also, where the fact like, oh, he turned state's evidence or he became a witness, so that's why he's not in jail. And unfortunately, that happens too. Where this fucking, I definitely agree with that. I will say though, I really like Giancarlo Giannini in this movie as the inspector. I think he's fucking great. I think he's a cool kind of new character that I feel if they would have maybe done a little bit more with him instead of relying on all of Clarice, I think you'd add a little bit more excitement to the movie, where it's this aging inspector at the end of his career and he's got this beautiful young wife that it's hard to keep her like sort of happy, he thinks, but clearly she's fine. And like, it's just, I think it could be a lot more fun. I think the biggest problem with this movie is, and the story too, the book, is the reintroduction of Starling. I don't think you need it.
No, especially not helped by total character assassination for Clarice Starling. After
100%.
I love so much, obviously, like Clarice in the original movie, played by Jodie Foster, is so amazing. I think she, despite winning one of the many people who won Oscars for that movie, she feels like sort of the one that doesn't get as much of like the cultural sort of stamps. And it's such a shame because I think she's just as important, like any of the like fava beans and a nice Chianti stuff from Anthony Hopkins. Just as important is just the way Jodie Foster says, Dr. Lecter.
I agree.
Dr. Lecter. It's so
100%.
key. And Julianne Moore is our woman of the hour, is treated such an unfair hand where it's like, hey, follow up this amazing performance that won an Oscar, but also you have to make the character your own kind of, but also we're turning this character into a hothead FBI idiot agent.
Yeah, you're going to be an action hero right in the beginning.
I hate that sequence, by the way.
I fucking hate it.
So bad.
It kills the character right away.
Yes.
There's no way, watching Silence of the Lambs and the Clarice Starling character, did she go from this being this FBI analyst and, almost like into psychotherapy and psychiatry, become an agent in the field killing like Guanian drug dealers? Like, what is happening?
In the original movie, it's such a great dynamic of her like still being in training and very fresh and so she doesn't have as much field experience, but she is clearly intelligent and thinks about these cases so wonderfully. Like, there's that mixture of, like, unpreparedness, but also clear preparedness as much as she can.
It's like naivety. It's like a new eye on things. Right. She's not jaded.
Yes. Right, as opposed to, like, the jadedness is just done through, like, oh, you're a bad agent. You're, like, a terrible agent who should not be in the field because you're doing brash, dumb decisions that, like, get people killed.
Because you're fucking reckless as hell. Right, exactly.
Right, she becomes, like, the typical loose cannon cop, just like, all right, Clarice, you're off the force. They literally do that at a certain point, which is like, you're on suspension.
But god damn it, we need Sterling. Like, it's so fucking dumb. It's so dumb. And then the whole shit that they do, like, don't get me wrong, the sort of cross character with, where it was Scott Glenn in the first one, and then became Harvey Keitel in Red Dragon or whatever. And then, obviously, Lawrence Fishburne in Hannibal. They take that character away and they give you the Ray Liotta character. Hates her because she rebuked his sort of advances.
Yeah, who feels the most like, from, I mentioned earlier, David Mamet wrote an original screenplay for this that apparently everyone hated, and Steve Zalian, like, hastily rewrote. He feels like the biggest lingering thread of the David Mamet thing, where he feels very much like a bad David Mamet character.
Yeah, there's no question.
For sure. Though, credit to Liotta, I think he embraces it in a way that at least is like, he's pretty, like, a solid supporting character, and then the ending thing with him, his brain getting eaten, it's probably the highlight of the movie for me, is his performance during that whole thing. He's so fucking great.
Yeah, no, it's the best part of the movie. I completely agree. But then, I guess my problem is, too, we're getting to the ending here a little bit, with the whole brain eating thing, like, that's disturbing. And then Hannibal cuts his own hand off or whatever. But then, so this character that they're trying to make you almost feel sympathy for the whole movie, I want him to get away, Hannibal Lecter. Then he feeds the brain to a kid. It just makes it like the ultimate evil again. Like, this isn't earned.
Well, even before that, you have all this stuff, like, during that sequence where he has drugged Clarice and has, like, a horrible forced kiss with her during that whole sequence.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Like, and all this other stuff, too, where, like, before this point, you have, like, all this stuff in Italy's, like, I think the closest they get to making him kind of, like, a fun anti-hero in a way that I think betrays the character, but that's at least the most of it feels kind of, like, fun and interesting.
He's kind of scary in Italy.
And he's still kind of contained because he's, like, trying to, like, fit into society, but he still is, like, occasionally able to do, like, fun bursts of just, like, oh, look here, I'm gonna, like, flay your fucking organs and shit like that. It's like, that's a bit more, like, Grand Guignol fun.
Stabs that pickpocket in the groin and bleeds him out.
Yes.
That type of shit. You're like, holy fuck. I swear, once he leaves Italy, though, and you get Starling more involved, then the movie just sort of teeters down and becomes just, I don't want to say cliche, because I don't think that's accurate, but it loses me pretty quick.
The whole sequence where, like, he leads her to the mall, and he's, like,
around he's on the carousel and shit. Yeah, it's so
like,
dumb.
Clarice, you were so warm. You were so warm. Just, like, it feels so much more, like we mentioned, like, that is where they are turning him into, like, a Freddy Krueger character.
Yeah.
In a way that I just feels, like, detrimental to, like, that hidden menace that you had that was just like, oh my god, he's, like, contained. What can he do? When he's out and about, he's so much less interesting as a character.
I completely agree.
Because it just feels like, oh, like, he can be, like, around every corner. He's like a boogeyman that pops up. It's like, no, you should be like this evil that burrows under your skin, but shouldn't be just like, boom, I'm gonna pop out, scare you. It's like, no, this isn't Halloween Horror Nights house. It's fucking Hannibal Lecter, man.
Right. Are you worried what your mommy and daddy would think of you? Why? What is this? Stop.
Yeah.
And he's wearing, like, a tactical jacket and hat. Like, this is so stupid. Like, what is happening here? And he lets himself get caught to, like, save her. Like, it's so dumb. It's so dumb. And the thing is, I guess one of my biggest problems with it is that you're sort of led to believe in the beginning half of this movie and all of Silence Slam that he is, like, the smartest man alive. He's impervious to psychoanalysis. He can literally talk someone into swallowing their own tongue. Like, he's just the smartest man. He's ahead of everyone. And this, just dumb decisions the whole movie. Like, you're going to kill Benini and then throw him over the balcony, but then allow yourself to be shown on footage and wave to the camera. Really? No.
I think a big part of that also is just Anthony Hopkins at this point in his career, after like Silence of the Lambs kind of like rejuvenized his career because he was kind of like on the outs as like a character actor sort of type before that, not doing a lot. And then Silence of the Lambs obviously won his Oscar and he became so in demand.
Deserved.
Right. Totally deserved. But after that point, he definitely turned from Silence of the Lambs to Noise of the Hams, which I would argue this movie should be titled. Because he is like fully going into, he fully went into like very hammy, over the top performances, taking as many paychecks as possible. Like, this is right after Mission Impossible 2, where he's in like 5 minutes and got like I think $3 million off of it and shit like that. Right, like, and it just like he's in full like sort of hammy mode, which sometimes is kind of fun, but largely is very like much what leads into the detrimental kind of treatment of Hannibal from here on.
Would you say you like this performance of Hannibal Lecter better than the performance in Red Dragon?
I would at least say I think Red Dragon, it works a bit more just because at least it's the structure of the story works fine, and it feels a bit more in keeping with like the sort of Silence of the Lambs portrayal of just like him being contained. But also, I mean, there are other problems with that movie that we won't get into now, but yeah, particularly just like, hey, Brett Ratner, how about you try and recreate what Jonathan Demme did in so many scenes? And it's like, no, he can't do it.
No, I think the biggest problem with Red Dragon, it's clearly like Anthony Hopkins 30 years later. Like, he doesn't, there's no way. Yeah, it's a prequel.
Well, I mean, sadly, only like 11 years later. Because like I said, Hannibal came out February 2001, and Red Dragon came out October 2002. So it's only like 18 months after this movie, basically. And he does look much older even than 11 years. But they're trying to sell us on like, oh no, the lead up to this is right before Silence of the Lambs. There's a lady here to see you from the FBI, Hannibal. Like, oh, fuck off. Fuck off with that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with you. You know, but the thing about this movie is, I don't hate it. This is one of those that I generally don't hate. Every time I've seen it, which I haven't seen it that many times, but I've never like disappointed. I think it's stupid, but I remember like, oh god, like it's okay. Red Dragon, Brett Ratner, but like even like Hannibal Rising is terrible.
That is worse, I would agree, than this one necessarily is. Yeah.
It's bad. No shame. Well, you know, Gaspar Ulliel, R.I.P. But he's miscast, woefully miscast, and sort of everybody else is miscast. Nobody in that movie.
I mean, it's a dumb story.
It's a very dumb story. Basically, Hannibal is Batman. Yeah, that's kind of what
they're trying to give him like a Batman Begins origin story. It's
you're like, no. Hannibal Lecter doesn't know how to fight like a samurai. Right. What is happening?
Oh my! Yeah, he studied the blade at him.
It's so fucking stupid.
But no, I agree that all that stuff's stupid. But I think Hannibal, while like I'll say I loathe this movie. I think when I initially saw it, now I don't necessarily hate it, but it has too many big, massive detrimental problems for me to like ever say that I think it's okay or fine. Not just with like to Silence of the Lambs, but even just on the movie's own terms. Like, we haven't mentioned much about Ridley Scott's direction. I hate how this movie looks. It has this like really dull, washed out sort of look of like the early 2000s in a way that like while I was watching this, I just felt like I would have way preferred Tony Scott's Hannibal.
I think that would have been better. Yeah, I think you get bursts of cool shots in this movie, but for the most part, I agree. It's very bland. You know, some of the ones I think like, you know, even Hannibal Lecter with where he pulls out the blade and the light of the blade's on his face. He's got that crazy smile. Really cool scene. Like, he looks great. There's a couple cool moments as far as the way it looks, but for the most part, yeah, it's gray and bland. Like, it doesn't feel like anything. But yeah, if you would have got like a Man on Fire Tony Scott to do this, fuck yeah, give me that movie.
Yeah, and then, you know, I think that's even like, that's also obviously a problem with like Red Dragon, where it's Brett Ratner trying to both recreate scenes from Manhunter horribly, and then also sort of try and create like a David Fincher-esque crime thriller and doing it like as half-assed dime store as possible.
Well, because he's terrible. He's a terrible director.
Terrible human, terrible director. Completely agree.
I mean, he's never good. Fuck him.
Yeah,
yep,
for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously the Manhunter, say what you will, obviously I like the director.
Yeah, it's a great movie, right? We're both in agreement. It's a great, awesome movie. That's so awesome.
Silence of the Lambs, even better. I love Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And then I feel like it's a natural sort of progression down after Silence of the Lambs. I don't know. I honestly think Hannibal and Red Dragon are probably neck and neck for me. I have equal problems with both. But it's just kind of a natural progression down. It's a franchise that obviously with the TV show, great, but I don't need to see anymore. Like I'm good. And to get on the Julianne Moore of it, I guess obviously you could tell we haven't been talking about it that much because she's kind of a non-entity.
Yeah.
Like she really doesn't matter in this story. Like she only matters just to get Hannibal Lecter from A to B. That's the only reason.
Right, and she spends so much of the movie like in those like crime labs and listening to
on the phone,
which I'm so fucking angry that they had the gall to recreate the audio recordings and have her do like the Jodie Foster stuff. Just like, fuck you. How dare you do that?
I completely agree. Just play his parts. You don't need to hear her then.
Or don't even do that. Have Clarice do something more interesting. Just listen to like remember this when I did this a decade ago.
Yeah, remember when you just wanted Oscar. Yeah.
Right, you can see why, like, the only person who agreed to come back was Anthony Hopkins, because he got a massive payday. Because, like, they offered it to Demi, Foster, and Ted Talley, who adapted the screenplay for Silence of the Lambs.
Excuse me, Frankie Faison.
Oh, that's true. Yes, of course. So vital. With like, what pisses me off, like, right at the start is him, like, selling the memorabilia. It's like, look, it's the mask. And it's like, no person in universe would give a shit about that mask.
No, right, exactly. Right away, you're like, oh, nostalgia baity. Holy shit. I mean, this movie tags you with it right in the opening.
Yeah, I think that's the problem where, like, I would say this is, like, slightly more detrimental to me than even, like, a Red Dragon, where Red Dragon at least functions as, like, the story that was from, like I said, like a Manhunter in the original book. At least it's, like, functional, as opposed to this movie has, like, such a distorted, weird story that has, like, too much but also too little happening at the same time, and so weirdly structured that it just, like, annoys me a lot more, as opposed to at least Red Dragon, while it also is guilty of doing Silence of the Lambs references, at least has, like, enough of a structure to work, and also has, I would argue, a better supporting cast that's able to strengthen up, say, maybe the most bored Edward Norton has ever looked in a movie. He is so
for
checked
sure.
out in that fucking
But you get Keitel, you get Hoffman.
Yes.
You get, there's a pretty fun
Emily Watson.
cast.
There's a lot of, like, good performers in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have to agree. This is one of those where every time I've seen it, and it's not very often, like maybe every couple of years I've seen this, I forget a lot of the shit in it. So it leaves no impression on me, which is bad. That's not good. But where Hannibal Rising, I remember the bad shit in that. Red Dragon, unfortunately, because of the Brett Ratner of it all. But like this one is just kind of like a blank spot every time I see it.
Yeah, I remember a lot more of the bad shit in this one. I think it works out where Hannibal Rising can be the worst one and very bad, but I don't think that excludes, like, by comparison, I don't think that makes Hannibal look that much better, quite frankly. It is guilty of many of the same flaws. It just has the benefit of better actors and at least a better director and, like, some of that stuff that makes it, I would argue, slightly above the bottom. It's not too far off from the bottom, to me.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I think we've talked about this movie a lot. Let's go ahead and, like, wrap up. Any final thoughts, Adam, about Hannibal?
It's not the best of the sequels, but is it better than Red Dragon? I don't know. It's certainly not better than the last one, and it's certainly not better than the television show. I would argue that is the best follow-up to Silence of the Lambs we've gotten, whereas it's a prequel 100%, but it's like the better version that we needed. I don't think we need a continuation of Lecter, Spot and Chilton coming off the airplane that we get at the end of Silence of the Lambs. I don't need to know where these characters go from there. Where they came from, sure. Hannibal Rising did that very poorly, but the Hannibal TV show, fucking brilliant, perfect. And Milkinson, if you're not going to get Hopkins, Milkinson is Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, I would say the TV show, Silence of the Lambs, and Manhunter are the only Hannibal things you should give a shit about. Because as much as I'm saying, like, oh, Red Dragon's slightly better than Hannibal is, it's like a massive drop-off between, I would argue, Manhunter and Red Dragon. And then Hannibal isn't too far behind a Red Dragon necessarily. I think those three sort of follow-up sequels, prequels to Silence of the Lambs are movies that, like, whatever we're saying, like, oh, like, there's some elements that work, some things that don't, they just sort of, they're key examples of, like, why Hannibal shouldn't be, like, a massive continuing franchise. Despite, in Hannibal, like, some interesting stuff, some compelling, like, elements, like some performance stuff, some of the stuff in Italy, like I mentioned, there's a couple, like, kind of bright spots. It is exactly the kind of problem with sequelization that, like, we complain about a lot. It has, like, so many of those massive problems that, just, I would recommend, if you're curious about any of these movies, I'd just say stick with Sounds of the Lambs and Manhunter, and then go to the TV show. I think those are the only good things, quite frankly.
Yeah, I can't disagree.
Except on Manhunter, which I would like to.
Well, man, I guess I don't like William Pearson. I really don't.
Far more interesting than Edward Norton is in that movie.
Especially with his perm. Especially with his man perm.
Yeah, I think it works great. Along with everything else about that movie, pretty much. But that's a discussion for another day. Because we're done talking about our double feature here. And now we're moving on to our weekly segment, The Double Redo. 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 That works. So the Double Redo is a segment we do every week in which Adam and I bring up a good and a bad feature related to the topic. So this week for Julianne Moore, each of us have a good movie we'd recommend to everybody out there, and a bad one we'd recommend you steer clear of. I'm going first here, and I'm going to go ahead and start off with my good pick for Julianne Moore is one of her nominated performances, which I hadn't seen until doing the research for this episode. And I'd heard at least a lot about The Hours from 2002, which is this interesting sort of like trinity of the big Oscar actresses of like that sort of like 90s into 2000s era. So in The Hours, we follow three different timelines. We follow first 1923, where we have Virginia Woolf, the real author, played by Nicole Kidman in her Oscar-winning turn. Then in 1951, we follow Laura Brown, as played by Julianne Moore. And then in 2001, we follow Clarissa Vaughn, played by Meryl Streep. And basically how their various storylines kind of intertwine to some degree, where Virginia Woolf is like out of her normal London at like a home in the country that she's kind of been sequestered off to after she's had some issues with suicide attempts and stuff, and her husband's kind of keeping her over there. Then in the 50s, one with in 1951 storyline with Laura Brown, it's a lot about her being sort of like the dissatisfied 50s housewife. And then in 2001, we have Clarissa Vaughn with Meryl Streep, where she plays this celebrated publisher who is trying to make things work with both her lover, played by Allison Janney, and her ex-lover, played by Ed Harris, where she's trying to hold like a big party for him as he's being honored, but he's dying of AIDS, while she's trying to balance her whole life with that point. And I think it's an interesting parallel sort of story movie where like these storylines interweave with each other. We like cut back and forth between them. And I was curious because I had, like, three powerhouse talents like that and so many other great actors in there. I was so curious to see it. But I was worried, like, is it going to be sort of like a forgotten Oscar movie that I can see kind of why it's forgotten, kind of like I mentioned with The End of the Affair earlier in the episode. But I was so compelled by not just each of these storylines and each of these actresses doing great work, but how these sort of intertwine, whether it be thematically or in some cases like actual storylines kind of like crossover, where I won't spoil the stuff with how some of them intertwine like very much with characters and stuff, but I think all of those like main actresses and so many other great supporting people in here, like Claire Danes shows up, Jeff Daniels, John C. Reilly, as you mentioned previously, Miranda Richardson, so many great like people in this cast. But it's such like a great example of like what I love with like sort of these different timeline movies, where you see sort of like all these recurring thematic trends and eventually how they all wrap up together. I think is so beautifully done. And despite Nicole Kidman winning for Virginia Woolf, which I think it's a very good performance from her, I would say it's not quite as strong to me as the work that Streep does, which I think she's obviously amazing in here, and like her chemistry off with like Allison Janney and Ed Harris is wonderful in the movie. But Julianne Moore kind of feels like the great linchpin of this movie, and you don't quite realize it as like the story goes along. You learn more and more about her character and her sort of like a great version of kind of like the dissatisfied 50s housewife, which she had done even just this year, also nominated for Far From Heaven, which I think is another great performance from her. But this one feels a bit more kind of like grounded in a certain reality that's very tragic, and especially when you find out what she kind of does near the end of the movie. I think it's heartbreaking, but at the same time you get why she necessarily would have done this, the decisions that she makes, because you understand her character so fully. I think it's a tremendous movie that I wish, kind of got a bit more love in the modern era. And then my bad pick is one I've talked about in passing previously when we talked about Monuments Men. In terms of that one was directed by George Clooney, and was a pretty bad movie we didn't like on the show. But I would argue his worst directorial effort, and just one of the worst big sort of like attempted Oscar hopefuls that failed miserably in recent history, is Suburbicon, which was this weird Frankenstein movie that basically involves two different scripts that were melded together. There's one section that is written by the Coen brothers, that was about Matt Damon playing this 50s suburban dad who ends up getting caught up in a horrible sort of like death of his wife, who is played by Julianne Moore. That like a horrible like death situation that goes wrong, and him kind of covering up elements of that. And then when Julianne Moore plays the wife's twin sister, who comes to live with the family for a bit, it's this like very sort of poor attempt at like kind of like a Hitchcockian thriller with like elements of like Vertigo and some of these other things that also is trying to be a bit satiric. That doesn't work for me. And then in the background of all this, there is this actual like based on a true story sort of subplot in which the neighbors next door to Matt Damon and his family are this black family that moves into an all-white suburb and becomes the sort of target of racism of the time. That's deeply upsetting. But the problem is they're background characters, and that true story is paid lip service to be like the distraction that keeps the neighborhood from focusing on this dumb murder mystery plot that's going on. And it is such a miscalculation tonally, and I think it's some of the worst performances from all these people involved, including even Miss Moore, who I think is very much sort of misguided around. Damon's pretty bad, and there's a lot of like poor use of great actors in this movie, except for I would say Oscar Isaac's the highlight, who pops in as like this guy who's kind of like inspecting about the house and about the murder, and I think is like the one bright spot in a very bad movie. It's a big fucking mess, and I get why it was decried at the time and forgotten, because it's really fucking terrible.
Okay, so I've seen The Hours once when it was nominated, and I remember at the time it's like, okay, it just wasn't a movie at that era that I would have been into. It's one that I've kind of wanted to go back to, especially watch it maybe with my wife or someone like that. I think we could get enjoyment out of it, but just one I've never revisited. But I definitely want to. It's not one that ever comes up. I'm like, oh, what do you want to watch tonight? The Hours is not one that I ever think of for date night. As far as the bad, Suburbicon, never seen it. I'm barely aware of its existence. Like even you subscribing, I'm like, I think I remember the title card, like what the poster might have looked like. But it was one that I had no interest in. And just hearing you describe it, oh God, I am totally good. No interest.
Well, Adam, what about your choices for the double review this week?
For my good choice, another movie directed by the director of our good film tonight, Anderson's Magnolia. Another just amazing ensemble cast, amazing performances all around. Julianne Moore is fucking great in it. But this is another one, like you kind of pointedly said at the end of our discussion of Boogie Nights, where there's so many actors that if they came up and you said, oh, pick them, oh, good choice for them, like they would work. Like I'd argue Tom Cruise might be the best Tom Cruise. It's a really great movie. Disturbing, sad, but kind of funny too. Like there's just, Magnolia is this weird entity. And I kind of love it. And she is really great in it. And then for my bad, I have Kingsman: The Golden Circle, which is a sequel to a movie that I kind of liked. Nobody wanted a sequel. Nobody definitely wanted a prequel. And it's really bad. And Julianne Moore is making choices, like we talked about earlier, making a lot of them. But she feels terribly miscast and sort of just a stupid movie and a stupid plot and a stupid fucking cash-in. Like even the Ellen John stuff is so dumb. Like it's just a dumb movie. And she might be the brightest spot in a black hole. So nothing. It doesn't work on every level.
Yeah, I have seen both of your choices. Kingsman: The Golden Circle. I mean, yeah, I don't have much more to say beyond like what you've said, except I'll at least add that like I think Julianne Moore is trying to have fun as like a satiric version of a Bond villain, which I would think in other circumstances that sounds like a fun time and a great opportunity for Julianne Moore to like have like sort of a hammy part that she doesn't usually get to have. But that movie just suffers so much from repeating a lot of jokes from the first movie and also doubling down on like all the worst elements that I didn't like about Kingsman. Just removing any of the charm that was kind of there, that I still think is a bit there in the original movie. Not nearly as much as when I first saw it, necessarily. And then for your good pick, Magnolia, that was interesting where that was one when I saw it initially after like getting into PTA and like really loving Boogie Nights. That was the one that I heard like, oh my God, it's like his best movie, so amazing at that particular point, like in the early 2000s. And I was not a huge fan of it at the time when I was younger. I thought just like, oh, this is a bit overrated as a movie. And then I revisited it about like a year or two ago. I was just, I need to finally sit down and watch all 3 hours and 15 minutes of Magnolia again. I had a much better opinion of it. I think it does juggle a lot of its storylines very well. I think it has a great ensemble, as you mentioned. I would agree that Cruise is amazing, but also like Philip Seymour Hoffman is, and like obviously Moore is, and especially in the sequence at the pharmacy is a tour de force performance from her. Her big rant about just like, do you know who I fucking am? Such a good like bit, such an amazing performance from her. And yeah, I think it's not my favorite PTA movie, but I would say it's definitely amongst like his top 5 for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up here our double review by repeating our choices. I'll go first with my good choice was The Hours, and my bad choice was Suburbicon.
And my good choice was Magnolia, and my bad choice is Kingsman: The Golden Circle.
Yeah, so we're going to start wrapping up the show here, but stay tuned. At the very end, we'll pick our movies for next episode. But before that, we got to thank some people like Chris Oliver for the intro and outro music used for our show. Listen to more of his music at chrisoliver.bandcamp.com. Thanks to Christian Thorlally for our great artwork. Follow him at Night of Water, that's Night with a K, _of_water, on various socials for all his amazing stuff. And thanks, of course, to our loyal Patreon supporters, who, for the $1, you all get to do stuff like vote in polls for topics and individual movies we do. Like this particular episode was chosen, as I mentioned, by our patrons. So thank you so much, Edgelords, as we like to call you out there, our little pet name for you. And we also get the bonus podcast stuff, which we should mention right now. You can listen to our Friday the 13th audio commentary. And on that, we announce what we're going to be doing for February, which is going to be a lot of fun, where we are introducing our award show, our first annual Double-Edged Double Bill award show, dubbed what, Adam?
The Dubs. D-U-B-Z. I kind of want to call it D-U-B-B-Z, but D-U-B-Z tentatively. The Dubs.
Yes, we intentionally picked a name that,
the
if an actor...
name.
The stupidest name to where, like, if we actually send a physical award to any of our winners, they would just be like, the Dubs. What is this? Throw it in the trash.
Yeah, we can't afford to do that anyways.
No, we can't. For sure. We'll send them an email just like, oh, you get this.
Hey, by the way, buddy, you got a Dubs. These 2 idiots like you.
Steven.Spielberg@gmail.com. Here you go.
Judd Hirsch, Actor of the Year. Every year.
No matter what, even if it wasn't in the movie.
No matter what.
The annual Judd Hirsch Award goes to Judd Hirsch.
This year, the annual Judd Hirsch Award goes to Judd Hirsch.
But yes, so for the $1 a month, you get all that bonus stuff. So if you're interested, please sign up. It helps out the show, keeps the lights on and everything. But if you want to, follow us on various socials, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at DEDBpod. And you can also submit feedback to us at our email, doubleedgedoublebill@gmail.com, all spelled out there. And you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at both marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com. And just a shout out, on my blog where I often post episodes of the show, it's been a while since I've written anything. And I just recently posted up, finally, after, racking my brain and a bit of delay, my top 20 films of 2022, which you can read over there. Put a lot of heart and soul into that particular list and, give it a read if you're curious about the big movies of the year. Though keep in mind, for the dubs, those choices, there's a lot more stuff with like actor, actress, international film, a lot more interesting qualifier. Anything can change before the dubs happen.
Yeah, his number one is Marmaduke.
Yes, of course. Yeah, Pete Davidson, my favorite performance of the year. Dub spoilers.
Yeah,
best leading actor.
Find me on Instagram at Atom or Adam, ATOM_R_ADAM. You can find me on Letterboxd at Schwanson. And I also recently did a guest spot on friend of the show, good guy Rafe Telsch. Have not seen this podcast, where we talked about one of my favorite movies that nobody knows about. We talked about the John Hillcoat weird Australian Western, The Proposition. Although I will say, I do make a comment about a certain actress that I wish was edited out. I wish it wasn't in there, but it is. So you can be mad at me if you want, but I regret it. But that's fine. Great movie.
Maybe you should give an apology right now, because I'm sure she's listening here. Give a straight up apology to that actress.
She's not listening.
In the ether. Give it to her, just for posterity's sake.
Maggie Gyllenhaal, I don't think you look like a shoe.
There. Yes, he's sorry. But yes, I did listen to that Proposition episode, and aside from that comment, lots of fun in there. A lot of entertaining stuff in that episode. Really fun. I love, I'm glad that Rafe has that show back up. He just relaunched it. And you're the second episode of that. And I hope he keeps it up at a decently consistent level in the future, because he's a great podcaster in his own way.
He's fucking awesome. I love Rafe.
But for more of this podcast, subscribe to us on places like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows on the network that several people have guested on the show, are the main hosts of. And you can also dig into the archives on our Podbean main feed for over 200 episodes before we join Talk Film Society. And everything else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that $1, can be a lot for some people. We totally get it. The totally free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility.
Yeah. What the fuck? Just make it happen, guys. Especially you, Rafe. I know I said I love you, but I lied. I hate you.
Remember when I said I loved you? I lied.
It was a lie.
Well, now, Adam, it's time we end this episode by doing our picking for next week. So as we do at the end of every episode, Adam and I switch up on quality for one of us has 2 good picks, one of us has 2 bad picks, and we assign them between 1 and 10 for each of those choices for next week's topic. And the other person will pick a number between 1 and 10, and we'll say, so, for example, I'm going to pick number 9, and the other person who has the choices will be like, okay, at number 10, I had this particular choice. So that's how we get our good and our bad feature. Though, we have to keep in mind, of course, the Godfather rule is still in effect, which basically Adam and I were given vetoes back in May to use if we hear a particular choice and we say, actually, I don't want to cover that choice, so I'll take the cannoli. We have one opportunity to say that each year. So it'll be like, okay, you take the cannoli, so that choice is gone. We gotta go with whatever other choice is there for either the good or bad pick. And I've used mine already. Adam has his. He has until May to use it, because then it's gone.
Yep.
So he might do that for my good picks that I have for next week's topic, which is bottle films, in honor of Knock at the Cabin is coming out, the new M. Night Shyamalan film that I'm very curious about, and the sort of premise of that movie is that it all takes place in one singular location of the titular cabin. So we decided to do the bottle movies episode to basically have the same thing, which is like, okay, movies that take place in one singular location, which I think is an interesting challenge for movies to do.
Oh, I agree. To the point where we had to open up a little bit. Instead of, when you might think of bottle films, you might think of one room or one small area. We opened it up to one location to where like an airplane could work or apartment building or something like that, but it's still in the one singular location.
So yeah, I have the 2 good for this. As I mentioned, you have the 2 bad, Adam. So you go ahead and go first, please, for my 2 good picks. Pick a number between 1 and 10.
We'll go with number 1.
At number 3, I have a movie that I know I've already seen with Adam previously, and we kind of agreed, like, after we watched it, like, we have to cover this movie at some particular point. It mostly does take place at one location, though. It's a pretty big, spacious location of a motel, and I think it's a criminally underrated movie that I can't wait to talk about with Adam. It is Bad Times at the El Royale.
Fuck yeah. Ooh, I didn't even expect that. Yeah, hell yeah. Oh, we're definitely talking about that. Oh, I can't wait to rewatch that. That's one of the ones that I've seen recently that, some of them are like, I've seen it. No, I want to rewatch that. I'm good. Yeah, fuck yeah. I
Yeah,
ain't
we'll
choosing
have a
to
lot
cut
to
over.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But on the other side of things, I had an older film that I actually watched recently for Halloween. Over at number 10, I have the sort of horror thriller starring a very odd cast of Audrey Hepburn and Alan Arkin, Wait Until
Oh,
Dark.
that's an interesting one. I haven't seen that in forever. I remember really kind of being plus on that one. So that's a good one too.
I think it's a
All
wonderful
right.
little movie for sure, yes. But at the same time, I'm very happy with Bad Times at the El Royale. Now, Adam, speaking of bad, let's
Yeah,
see
buddy.
about your choices. I'll go ahead and go the opposite route of you. I'm going to pick number 8.
Okay, at number 9. And by the way, both of my entries start with a P. Popping my peas. Popping my peas. At number 8, I have, which everybody thought was going to be successful because you had two amazing, like hot young actors, and it's not good, and it's a lot of moral problems with it. I have the Chris Pratt, Jennifer Lawrence Passengers.
Heard a lot about Passengers. I've avoided Passengers.
Well, no, no choice now.
But what was your other choice?
Number 2, I had the 2006 Soulless remake of a classic disaster film, Poseidon.
I have seen Poseidon. Not a fan. The original Poseidon Adventure, a flawed but pretty good of like the disaster movies of that era. Yes,
Yeah,
a
it's
fun
fun.
movie. Yes,
Yeah.
unlike the Wolfgang Peterson disaster, both figuratively and literally at the box office film of Poseidon. Yes. All right, but so Passengers and Bad Times of the El
Bad
Royale.
Times of the El Royale. Hell yeah.
We'll be doing both of those next week. But until then, everybody, we have to go because we're having an old friend for dinner.
His name is Rafe Telsch. He tastes like shitty jerky.
I think he tastes like completely fine, edible jerky.
No. It's bad like Jack Links, like the worst Jack Links.